Thank you for joining us today. I'm Chris Cable from the Accounting Services Division of the Auditor General's Office. Presenting with me today is Phil Hannes from our IT Audit Division. Phil is an experienced IT auditor in our school district performance audits and specializes in the IT control evaluation that our office does as part of those audits. This webinar is the third in a series of webinars on information technology controls that our office is presenting for school districts. The slides for this webinar are posted on our website at azauditor.gov under Reports and Publications, School Districts, and Webinars. In today's webinar, we'll focus on network controls. All of the topics for this series of IT webinars are related to areas our office has identified either through the compliance questionnaires completed by your financial auditors or through our own performance audits as areas that districts can make improvements in to better secure their network and accounting and student information systems. So let's take a little closer look at what we're covering in the webinar today. Today, we'll discuss all of the topics on your screen. As you can see, there's quite a few. So we'll obviously be hitting them in a very brief manner, but be able to introduce the information related to each of these controls. So keep in mind that this webinar is designed for IT employees. So there may be some IT jargon intended for that audience. If you have any questions about a term or a jargon item that we may use as we go, please feel free to ask a question again on the right side of your screen in the question box, and we'll be happy to help you understand. So now that we're all on the same page on what we'll be covering in this webinar, let's refresh our memories briefly as to what IT controls are and why they're important, in case we have some folks who tuned in that aren't maybe fully dedicated to IT process. So what do we mean by IT controls? They're defined measures taken to minimize risk and ensure business objectives are being met. They help protect against loss of data and hardware, unauthorized access, and they can also help protect against theft or fraud. We know that to non-IT personnel at your district that you interact with, IT controls can seem confusing, and unfortunately, there isn't a magical compliance checklist that can be used. There are, however, many IT standards and best practices to choose from. And some IT controls are dependent on each other, but some other controls stand more alone. So you may need to help people at your district better understand the information related to securing your networks and systems. There are also different ways to implement the IT controls that you determine are best suited to your district. In the first webinar in this series, we provided information on various resources your district can use to develop and refine your IT controls based on IT standards and best practices. That webinar is, of course, posted on our website so that you can refer back to it or direct others to look at it as well. So now let's delve into the concepts of network control. Network control is a very broad topic to cover in a single webinar. So while we're covering some important topics today, we realize there are additional topics that districts could be interested in as well. We chose the controls we're covering today based on those items that we see districts struggling with during our audits. But they're not the only controls that need to be implemented. We will be posting an advanced, pre-recorded web presentation to cover additional information for interested IT personnel. And you may have noticed that we've already posted an appendix on our website that lists the sources used for this webinar, organized by slide number, to help you refer to the underlying standards and best practices that our presentation is based on. We listed and briefly described many of those sources in our first IT webinar. Of course, keep in mind that the materials referenced in the appendix are industry-recognized resources, but our use of particular source in this presentation does not represent our endorsement of that source in general or in that particular area as the only way to adequately control your network. All systems have similarities and differences, So there isn't any one-size-fits-all solution for network security. But there are underlying principles that these and other industry-recognized IT resources are built on. District IT personnel should be knowledgeable of their network operations and vulnerabilities and act in ways to reduce and, when possible, eliminate network control weaknesses by following standards and best practices. One last note on this issue is that at times, certain compromises may need to be made in implementing certain IT controls, depending on your individual environment. For example, as we covered in our second IT webinar in this series, complete separation of duties in your accounting system may not be possible due to small staff sizes. So compensating controls should be in place to adjust for individual employees having incompatible responsibilities and access in your system. Careful consideration should be given to any compromises in IT controls before they're implemented. And such compromises, along with the underlying reasons for making those compromises, should be documented. The compensating controls that mitigate the risk associated with those compromises in IT controls should also be documented. All of these controls make your data more secure and, as mentioned in a previous webinar, can help you not be the headline story on the 10 o'clock news, announcing that you had a data breach, that your district's records were somehow tied to a credit card scam, or that you've been paying fraudulent invoices. Or perhaps they'll keep you from being the subject of a story on students hacking into your grading system to change some of their grades, or even prevent you from being the focus of a story related to your staff or student personal information and FERPA information having been compromised. In response to these data privacy concerns, the U.S. Department of Education has created a Privacy Technical Assistance Center, PTAC, to help educational institutions with data privacy, confidentiality, and security practices. PTAC provides a variety of resources, including training materials and opportunities to receive direct assistance. Among the center's resources is the Data Breach Response Checklist, which was developed in part to help protect schools and districts because, as the Department of Education states in the checklist, efficient incident handling will also help reduce organizational liability. And really, that's one of the major benefits of strong IT controls, reducing the liability that your district could face when IT problems come up. PTAC stated that it's designed to provide educational stakeholders with a set of tools, resources, and opportunities to receive assistance to improve the privacy, security, and confidentiality of student-level data systems. It's also a means for states to share their best practices, documents, and other relevant resources in the areas of privacy, security, and confidentiality. It's designed to be a focal point for queries and responses to the privacy-related needs of state educational agencies, local educational agencies, and institutions of higher education in a confidential, safe environment. And it's also a set of resources to promote compliance with the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, and other best practices for ensuring the confidentiality and security of personally identifiable information. So now that we've talked about why security is important to school districts, let's begin our look at how to implement IT controls with the concept of layered security. Layered security is defined by Tech Republic as an idea that multiple types of security measures are needed, each protecting against a different vector or attack. Any single defense may be flawed, and the most certain way to find the flaws is to be compromised by an attack, and I know none of you want that to happen. So a series of different defenses should be used to cover the gaps in each protective capability. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, malware scanners, integrity auditing procedures, and local storage encryption tools can each serve to protect your information technology resources in ways the others cannot. In all truthfulness, most security experts believe there's no real possibility of achieving total, complete security against threats by implementing any collection of security solutions. Rather, technological components of a layered security strategy are regarded as stumbling blocks that hinder the progress of a threat, slowing and frustrating it until either it ceases or some additional resources, not strictly technological resources in nature like perhaps police enforcement, can be brought to bear. Now I'll turn things over to Phil to start us off looking at firewalls.
Thanks, Chris. Starting on the outside perimeter of a network, the first primary control is the careful use of firewalls. Firewalls are one of the cornerstones of IT security and help block malicious activity. At the most basic level, firewalls are intended to filter traffic between each side of the firewall to only allow permitted traffic. In order to achieve this filtering, careful configuration and testing are required. There are a few different types of firewalls, many of which may be used in conjunction with each other to help protect different areas of the network, including user machines and servers. For example, perimeter firewalls. These control traffic entering or leaving the network border. They provide a first line of defense against external attacks. For example, this type of firewall may restrict access to port 80 on a server, which is not meant to use that port as it is not a web server. Port 80 being HTTP, a protocol for serving web pages. In the modern computing environment, however, classic firewalls are losing favor to next-generation technology. With many services relying on similar protocols, as well as others breaking the defined rules of networking, firewalls were forced to become smarter to keep up with modern requirements. Next-generation firewalls review the actual traffic and monitor the behavior of the underlying applications and services. By monitoring the actual activity instead of simply the connection states and ports, next-generation firewalls are capable of filtering much more traffic. Depending on your environment, the procurement of the next-generation firewall may be out of reach. However, considering all options and obtaining appropriate technology should be considered. No matter what type of firewall is implemented, all districts should have some form of firewall between the outside or untrusted network, the internet, and the internal network. In addition to the external firewall, other hardware firewalls may be implemented to help provide segregation in the network. In addition to the perimeter and hardware firewalls, host-based firewalls should be implemented on each system, such as laptops, desktops, servers, and so on, to further protect each system. Again, generally, this firewall will allow or deny activity coming and going from the system it is running on to protect against threats. An example of this would be to prevent workstation-to-workstation communication, as is usually unnecessary. Host-based firewalls may also be utilized on servers as appropriate to implement restrictions regarding which systems may connect or communicate with them. For example, in an instance of a database server, it may be prudent to only permit connections from the application server. As part of the defense in-depth strategy, it is important to utilize multiple layers of detection and prevention, as extra layers permit for more opportunities to detect and prevent attacks. In order to support this concept of multiple layers, it often becomes necessary to use different types of security devices or applications that complement one another. Some examples of possible security devices or applications which may be used to build a defense in-depth strategy would be intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, antivirus, anti-malware, or email spam filters. In an ideal configuration, each device supporting security, including the firewall mentioned earlier, communicates and notifies the district of issues. Consequently, each system can interact and update its signatures based upon detections from other devices. Such a setup often requires the same vendor applications and devices, and as a result is not always obtainable in a pre-existing environment. Moving further into the network and systems, logical access controls are critical to system security. Although we have covered access controls as a broad topic in our previous webinars, the next few slides will discuss specific access control areas, as well as some common access methods to systems. To begin discussing access controls, it is critical to restrict administrative privileges. Misuse of administrative privileges represents a significant security issue for districts of all sizes. The classic view is that users should have administrative rights to reduce support calls. which creates an opportunity for malicious users and software to take control of individual machines and perhaps the entire network. For day-to-day activities, many users do not require administrative rights, provided the system is configured appropriately. Revoking administrative rights prevents such high-level access from being used against unwitting users and prevents users from accidentally causing harm to their system, such as changing settings or downloading software that contains viruses. Your IT administrative users should have more than just an admin user account. People who need to have admin user access should also be assigned a standard user account for everyday activities like checking email, reviewing reports, etc. They should use that account normally and only use their admin account when needed to perform more restrictive tasks. Both of these user accounts should be user-specific, as we have shown here. As we have discussed in the previous webinar, all administrative accounts and activities should be monitored to ensure activity is appropriate. Also, both IT administrator's standard account and their administrative account should be assigned to them alone and not be a generic or shared admin account.
You know, that's a great point, Phil. In addition to restricting and monitoring administrative privileges, actively managing all software on the network can help ensure only approved software is installed and can run on your network's machines. This can be done by having an inventory of all authorized and unauthorized software and a mechanism to either prevent software installation and use or alert IT personnel when software has been installed. If there are computers that have special exceptions, these should be noted so that only those approved machines can have certain software installed. Managing software is important because if unauthorized software is downloaded, these programs can cause incompatibilities or become an entry point for viruses, malware, and hackers. One method to control unauthorized software is application whitelisting. Application whitelisting is a concept whereby systems may be configured to only permit software to run if it's present within a list of approved programs. Contrary to the concept of traditional antivirus systems, which block known bad files, basically blacklisting, whitelisting enables administrators to clear safe programs and deny all others. In such situation, not only is malware prevented, but administrators may prevent users from utilizing software which they just don't want present on their network.
So right now, we'll be moving on to remote access. Accessing systems remotely is another form of access that must be controlled, but is oftentimes neglected when considering locking down access rights. This type of access, in any of its forms, is commonly referred to as remote access and is a concept by where users may connect to a system through a network. Typically, there are two types of remote access considered. Virtual private networks, commonly known as VPN, which connects from the outside a network, and remote desktop or secure shell, commonly known as RDP or SSH, which connects from inside a network. Both have somewhat separate uses, but appropriate configurations are necessary for both. In addition, VPN and RDP or SSH connections can be used in tandem. Plus, remote connections outside the network can be performed using RDP, SSH, or other types of connections alone. VPN connections are one of the most common methods for establishing remote connections from workstations to internal resources. These connections are often for systems outside of the internal network, but it's possible to utilize VPN connections internally if the environment requires such security. When implementing VPN, there are a few items that should be considered. One, are employees permitted to use personal devices through VPN? If employees are permitted to use personal devices through VPN, then you should consider those personal devices as part of your network. As a result, you need to ensure that the security of those devices are up to the standards of the systems that you install yourself, internal to your district network. And depending on the resources available, this may come in the form of a simple policy that stipulates what security configurations need to be in place, such as firewalls and anti-malware. It may also be in the form of network access control or protection, where the VPN concentrator or remote access control system runs checks against each connecting device to ensure that certain baseline security is in place, such as the presence of antivirus or installed patch levels. Second is multi-factor authentication. In addition to checking for the security of devices, multi-factor authentication should be implemented for all VPN connections, including from entity-owned machines where possible. This is a simple best practice that adds an extra layer of protection on top of your username and password by requiring an additional authentication method. Multi-factor authentication combines two or more independent credentials: what the user knows, your password, what the user has, a security token, and what a user is, so biometric verifications such as fingerprint scans. The goal of this is, again, back to the layered defense, which will make it more difficult for an unauthorized person to gain access. If one factor is compromised or broken, the attacker would still have at least one or more barriers to breach before successfully breaking into a target system. Adding this authentication also helps stop against brute force attacks. And as a VPN is simply a means of providing a secure connection, the protocols on this slide are intended to provide a method for remotely interacting with systems. This list is by no means exhaustive, and is simply intended to provide an explanation of some of the most heavily used protocols. Terminal Services/Remote Desktop Protocols, or RDP, is a protocol used to connect to Windows systems remotely, but provide an equivalent experience to a local logon. RDP access allows users to connect with any level of privilege, from basic to full administrator, and consequently includes some risks. For RDP, one of the most significant risks is improper configuration, which can lead to situations where the protocol's traffic is not secured sufficiently. In some instances, it is possible for a malicious user on the network to intercept the traffic on an RDP session and decrypt the traffic after the session ends. Once the traffic is decrypted, all information passed through the session, including key presses, is available. This enables malicious users to gather username and passwords and to perform their own RDP session into your systems. Next, Virtual Network Computing, or VNC, is a system that is intended for desktop sharing. VNC enables a graphical session whereby systems may be controlled as if one is present on the system. In its rawest form, VNC uses Remote Frame Buffer, otherwise known as RFB, which is not a secure protocol, and its traffic needs to be encrypted. This is often performed by utilizing a secure shell tunnel, also known as SSH. SSH is a cryptographic network protocol which, by default, provides console/terminal access to systems or devices. Secure shell is heavily used on Linux and Unix-based systems to provide a secure access to the system's shell. In addition to text-based sessions, secure shell may also be able to forward X window sessions, which is a graphical user interface, or act as a secure tunnel for other connections. Secure shell tunneling provides similar functionality as VPN, but is not intended to make a system act as part of an internal network. Instead, singular connections are created between ports on different systems to provide tunneling for certain purposes. SSH permits the use of password and key-based authentication. If possible, key-based authentication is more secure as it reduces the possibility of brute force passwords. In addition to authentication configuration choices, it is possible to restrict SSH to deny access to the root account. This is highly recommended to prevent direct access to a generic root account. If administrator privileges are required, a user should SSH to a system and then sudo to administrator privileges. This permits tracking of user actions in the system. In addition to the items above, and the others mentioned for controlling systems remotely, there are some deprecated protocols which should not be used due to their poor security. One such protocol is a telnet protocol. Although this protocol does still functionally operate, all information for the telnet connection is submitted in plain text, thereby providing no security over data. Any user with access to the network across which a telnet connection is being made could intercept the traffic and read its content. In addition, many implementations of telnet do not have proper authentication modes, which reduces the ability to control and audit the connections made to a system. Remote shell and remote process execution represent similar connections to remote shells and offer the same security issues as telnet: unencrypted traffic and poor authentication. Encryption is the application of cryptographic techniques to protect the confidentiality of information by encoding the information in such a way that only authorized users can decode and read it. Encryption is critical to protecting information from unauthorized access when data is stored. If data is important enough, it may also become necessary to implement transparent encryption or on-the-fly encryption to ensure the data is always secure until the moment of access. Depending on the need and the system in use, there are different levels of encryption to consider. Some of these options include file-level encryption, block-level encryption, and device hardware-level encryption. I'll briefly discuss each level of encryption, then talk about some of the key areas to consider for encryption. So file-level encryption is the act of encrypting a single file or folder to protect it from unauthorized access. This is often achieved through the use of encrypted archives. However, technologies such as PGP, or Pretty Good Privacy, and its equivalents allow the use of public-private key asymmetric encryption to protect singular files. Block-level encryption is what's typically known as full disk encryption. Block-level encryption will encrypt entire blocks of a device, or more typically, partitions of a device. In such a setup, an entire partition is encrypted during shutdown and decrypted at boot up, using some type of encryption key. While this protects against offline attempts to access a hard drive, any access obtained to the operating systems while the system is running will render the encryption useless, as the drive has already been decrypted. For instance, by having full disk encryption on laptops, if a laptop is stolen while turned off, the full disk encryption will prevent anyone from gaining access to any files and data on this machine. However, if the laptop was on and the user already decrypted the drive, and then someone gained access to the laptop, all the files will be readable and thus not encrypted. Finally, hardware-level encryption is included on some devices to provide encryption of an entire device at the hardware level. This type of encryption operates like full disk encryption, but offers a few benefits. Besides the performance increase, this provides the opportunity to encrypt all facets of a hard drive instead of being forced to leave a small unencrypted portion of the drive to boot, assuming the drive in question is a boot drive. One potential example of hardware-level encryption are encrypted USB drives, which have physical keypads present on the device. No software is required, and no special partitioning or block-level encryption is needed. The hardware on the device encrypts the drive when not used to protect the information.
You know, Phil, that was a great review of the levels of encryption, and now let's take a look at those key items that should be encrypted. There are many types of devices which should be encrypted. In a perfect world, all devices would be encrypted, but depending on the device, circumstance, and sensitivity of the data housed on it, some are more important than others. All of the following areas should be considered for encryption, and such encryption should be implemented if you determine that sufficient risk is present to warrant additional protection of your data. So with backups, you should always be encrypting backups, as the purpose is to serve as an archive. As an archive does not need to be accessed on a regular basis, the data should be encrypted to ensure that it is not subject to unauthorized access. And encryption really isn't a problem to your normal use of that information. Encryption there is especially important for backups because they're sent off-site often for storage by a third party. Although that third party may be trustworthy, any security breach of their environment may cause a breach of your district's data if your backups aren't encrypted. Also, workstation encryption is important, as workstations are often more visible and less secure than devices such as servers. Although desktop workstations may be viewed as more secure than laptops due to their static nature, sort of clunky configuration, the risk is still present that a desktop machine may be carried out of your facility. So consequently, those devices could be stolen and therefore should be encrypted. Also, the popular USB flash drive can represent a significant data leakage avenue if those devices are not properly secured. If possible, only encrypted flash drives should be permitted at your district, as one is certain, you're never really certain, what data will be transported on those flash drive devices. You can have policies that tell your users what they're allowed to put on those devices, but we all know policies occasionally are not followed. So even if users delete sensitive data from those flash drives when they're finished using them, a simple deletion may not be sufficient for the security of that data. Other methods may be necessary to securely erase data from flash drives when the flash drive wasn't encrypted. Mobile device encryption is also an important area. With ever-growing popularity of mobile devices, it's more critical than ever to ensure that any device which stores your district's data, including email, is encrypted. It will need a method, IT needs a method to track all mobile devices accessing sensitive information on your system and a way to ensure that they're properly encrypted. So with the exception of on-the-fly encryption, server hard disks are not typically encrypted, as full disk encryption is protection against offline access. And servers are pretty much 24/7 machines, so there's little to no chance that they'll be accessed offline. In addition, servers are often physically secured far better than any of the devices I discussed so far, which makes full disk encryption really less of an issue for them. Depending on the data, however, on-the-fly or file-level encryption may be appropriate for some of the data stored on a server. Districts should also consider the physical security of their servers and should implement full disk encryption if their servers are stored in a physically insecure environment. In other words, they're not behind a locked door where nobody else can get to them. So beyond encryption, properly securing access permission to data, both encrypted and non-encrypted, is critical. Although we discussed access controls in our previous webinar, an often neglected area is that of file share permissions. File shares are often the primary storage area for documents in districts. File shares allow employees to work together on projects to access each other's work to improve productivity. With this widespread sharing of information, however, considerable amounts of data are stored on file shares. More often than not, this data includes some type of sensitive information. As a result, it becomes critical for IT to properly manage the file shares and their permissions. All access control decisions on a file share should be based on a district's classification of data. These classifications will clarify exactly what data is sensitive and what may have more widespread access. For additional information on data classification, you can refer to our first webinar as well, the overview of general control policies. Once data is identified as either sensitive, confidential, or not confidential, appropriate restrictions must be placed upon that data. If this information must be stored in conjunction with non-sensitive information, but it's intended for only specific readers, either file-level encryption or file-specific access rights must be implemented to prevent widespread access to that information. To end this part of the discussion on access controls for this webinar, one final item to consider is the use of login banners. Login banners are a notification of acceptable use for computer systems. Although such banners often serve as a reminder to staff that their actions on the system must be pre-approved, one beneficial side effect to the potential recourse against malicious or unauthorized users that they provide. If a malicious user obtains access to the system and is informed of the confidential nature of the data, still they choose to proceed, such notification serves as a warning to those users that legal action will be taken against them. An example of a potential login banner is provided on this slide. Do note that this banner should be customized to your district's needs, rules, and style. Additional details may be required for your district, and the screenshot is provided simply to show an example, not to provide a correct example or endorse a specific style. Also, note that this is designed to get their attention and remind that only authorized users are allowed to access the system.
Yeah, that's very important. Next, we're going to be talking about vulnerability management, which is almost equally as important. After access controls, the next critical area that I want to talk about is vulnerability management, because due to that, that's how we know that your district isn't going to be vulnerable. As the frequency of security incidences and breaches have increased, the importance of vulnerability management is now more apparent. Vulnerability management is a process by which vulnerabilities in software are identified, categorized, prioritized, and remediated. This is a continuous process that must be performed on a regular basis to ensure the latest threats in an environment are identified and mitigated in a timely fashion. This process identifies vulnerabilities in software ranging from operating systems and network devices to web servers and web applications. All types of critical software should be checked by this process to ensure there are no weak spots in the security of an environment. The classic process for vulnerability management employs a vulnerability scanner, which is a tool that checks systems and identifies vulnerabilities. These tools use various checks ranging from simple version number comparison to mock exploit attempts to identify and verify potential problems in existing systems. Once such a tool is run, a report may be generated to document all the existing risks in an environment. With this list in hand, a district needs to analyze the issues and categorize the risks. This may use the tool's own risk ranking, or a district may perform their own ranking system based on their inherent knowledge of their environment. A district would plan out remediation steps for each system based on risk. This could include who's responsible for fixing the issue, how the issue should be fixed, and the deadline for the changes. Once this process is completed, a district would re-enter the process at the beginning and repeat. While there are methods by which a district could manually identify risk by pulling patch levels and comparing versions by hand, there are tools available, free or commercial, that will run automatic checks against your system. Hand in hand with vulnerability management comes patch management, which, if properly performed, will reduce the number of issues discovered during the vulnerability management checks. Patches to operating systems, firmware, and applications are designed primarily for three purposes: add new features, fix bugs or issues in functionality, or fix security issues. Although all are important, we will focus primarily on the final issue, security fixes. In many organizations, patches are evaluated and are chosen for production or not, depending on whether they are necessary and their impact on production functions. A patch which adds a new non-essential function but breaks critical application logic in another area would be, logically, not moved into production. In the case of security patches, however, all security patches should be migrated to production as soon as possible. These patches fix issues which either already have known public methods of exploitation or have a theoretical potential to cause issues for a district. Although some delay in applying security patches is understandable for testing purposes, security patches cannot be ignored forever. No hard and fast rule exists for the timeliness of patching. However, months out of date and certainly years out of date may be cause for alarm. The longer issues are publicly known, the greater the chance that an easy-to-use, highly effective exploit exists, which could seriously harm the integrity, availability, or confidentiality of your district's data. To prevent these issues from getting out of hand, you should track and manage patches for all systems and software. In order to appropriately track and manage patches in an enterprise environment, it becomes necessary to build a process around the concept of patch management. The backbone of this process is truly knowing what systems and software are in your environment. An up-to-date IT asset listing can help you do just that. The list should include every IT asset and the relevant details that you would need to determine if it is up to date. These details could include the patch levels of each system, or at the very least, information necessary to add into a patch management tool. Patch management tools, from platform-specific tools such as Microsoft Windows Server Update Services, or WSUS, to full patch management tools such as Lumention Patch and Remediation, are necessary to appropriately manage patches. These patch management tools act similar to a scanner in that they actively acquire patch-level information from systems. Depending on the patch management tool, however, some issues arise which cause the asset list to be a larger benefit. For certain tools, such as WSUS, instances can occur where a system, such as a workstation, fails to make a connection to the update server for an extended period of time, say like over a summer break. After sufficient time has passed, a system may fall off the WSUS list. Consequently, WSUS will fail to check the system for patch levels in the future. As such, WSUS may give a false sense of patch levels if it is only showing systems that are receiving patches and not all the systems on your network. By keeping the IT asset listing current, the system lists from your patch management tool can be periodically reconciled against the asset listing to ensure that all systems are still tracked appropriately. If any systems are missing from the patch management tool, the IT staff at your district may have to take corrective action.
So, in addition to managing vulnerabilities and patches, another key aspect of maintaining a network is storing and tracking the configurations for network devices, systems, and software. Configuration management is used to define and control the components of hardware and software by documenting current approved configurations to products in an enterprise environment. Configuration management includes tracking the current settings of all devices and software under the control of the district in normal day-to-day operations or in the event of a disaster. For instance, if a device was damaged and had to be replaced, not accurately tracking the current working configuration could mean a lot of time to figure out what the current configurations were and having to rebuild the device. Also, having a process to track configurations means that approval by management is documented. If a change needs to be made to a configuration, setting a device on a setting or a device or software, it should go through the proper change management channels to ensure that the change is authorized, tested, and approved. Once the configuration change is approved, the configuration needs to be documented, and the old configuration should be maintained for a period of time in case a rollback of configuration is needed. Configuration settings should be reviewed yearly or when major changes to the IT infrastructure occur to ensure that your current configuration is still applicable and functioning as designed. As configuration settings can be sensitive in nature, they should be kept in a secure location. Also, it's generally a good idea to have a way to access the configuration settings in the event of a disaster or outage. Once all the above controls that we've discussed have been implemented, it's still important to monitor systems for abnormal behavior on a regular basis. To achieve this end, appropriate logging and monitoring controls are necessary. Logging and monitoring are critical controls which allow IT staff to understand what's occurring in the system day to day. Without logging or monitoring, it's extremely difficult to identify issues in systems, which could range from software or hardware failures to intentional malicious use or fraud. The concept of logging and monitoring begins with the collection of system logs. This could include operating system logs, transaction logs from a financial system, access logs from a student system, or even firewall logs. Any system has the potential of providing a useful log if the system serves some critical aspect to the district. Once you've identified which systems can create logs, it's important to identify those items which are critical to log. You could pretty much bury yourself in logs if you logged everything. So due to the amount of information that can be processed and captured by any one system at any time, you need to filter down to the most critical pieces. By reducing the log data down to only those absolute essentials, district staff may draw valuable conclusions or detect critical events on which to take action. If all data is captured and reported unfiltered, you'll be buried, and the sheer quantity of information that you'll have may make you unable to successfully use that information at all. Once logs are collected, a process should be designed and documented for how to report and monitor those logs. If possible, individually filter or otherwise choose and report the important relevant information to assist your staff in actually monitoring the logs. The best logs in the world are useless if no one reads them, or if they're not read in a timely manner. The monitoring of systems and logs should be well established, and the personnel responsible for reviewing those logs should know it's part of their responsibilities and how often they should be doing it. Setting the timing of the monitoring is important for effective security, and some systems may need to be monitored even in real time, not after the fact. For both monitoring and logging aspects, it's important to understand that it's a district decision regarding what items should or should not be logged and monitored. Careful consideration should be given to each system and their respective housed data to ensure that your district can derive the most value from your logging and monitoring efforts. On the slide, you'll see a screenshot of a Windows Event Log Viewer. This tool has not yet been configured to filter out important information, but it simply lists the logs stored by the system. A better choice using this example would be to determine which security logs were important. Perhaps only certain users need to be tracked on the system, which could really reduce the number of logs that you're collecting and later reviewing.
And under the same umbrella as logging and monitoring, web content monitoring is also important. Due to some specific laws and regulations, school districts and libraries are held to even higher standards for web content than other state agencies. Unique to school districts and libraries, ARS 34-502 stipulates that every public school and library is required to have both policy describing internet safety as well as technical controls to block or filter certain prohibited content. This includes visual content that is obscene, child pornography, or harmful to minors. For the remaining topic slides, we'll be covering a range of subjects that do not necessarily fit into any general category. All these controls are still important and should be considered in their own rights. Wireless access provides a massive leap in convenience and accessibility for end users, but represents a significant security concern if not implemented properly. As appropriate and applicable, wireless access should be secured and segmented to prevent unauthorized access to information. Wireless access points have one of three encryption protocols: WEP, WPA, or WPA2. Of the three, WPA2 is the ideal encryption and should only be used, the only form should be used when you're using encryption. WEP uses an outdated encryption method, and tools have been designed which can crack WEP passwords in minutes using standard laptop equipment. WPA is an improvement over WEP, but still has its weaknesses. In all modern implementation, WPA2 with AES should be chosen as the primary configuration when possible. For WPA2 and WPA, two authentication formats are available: pre-shared key, commonly called PSK, and WPA-802.1x, commonly called enterprise mode. PSK uses a shared password for authentication. Although the passwords can be complex and lengthy, they are vulnerable to brute force attacks. Enterprise mode utilizes certificates and authentication, which prevents brute force attacks, but represents a more complicated configuration. Similar to standard network segmentation, wireless networks should be segmented as appropriate. If a guest network is implemented for any reason, this network should be segmented to internet access only and should not be permitted to access the internal network. Wireless access points should still be behind the primary external firewall. Wireless access points should not be connected directly to the public, the internet. Districts should also implement some method of detecting rogue access points, which are access points connected to the internal network which are not authorized for use. These could be added by employees wishing to have their own wireless access, or by malicious users with access to a public data drop or Ethernet port. Tools do exist which provide the functionality necessary to help detect these rogue access points. As with any product, all information systems eventually reach their end of life, which indicates the end of support from a vendor. While systems do not immediately break upon reaching end of life, the end of vendor support indicates a significant shift in the viability of a product. Without support from a vendor, products will not receive patches to fix bugs or vulnerabilities. These bugs or vulnerabilities could lead to data access to unauthorized users or could cause extended outages due to unstable products. When most people consider end-of-life products, the first items that usually come to mind are operating systems. The most recent product to reach end-of-life that had a massive impact was the end of Windows XP, which was on April 8, 2014. Coming out on July 14, 2015, extended support will end for Windows Server 2003. By way of comparison, Red Hat Enterprise Linux 3, which was also released in 2003, ended its support as of January 30, 2014. In addition to operating systems, databases, network devices, and application software also have end-of-life announcements for differing versions of their products. All these products should be kept updated to a version currently supported to ensure that systems and data are appropriately protected. As many districts will have core functionality on systems which are reaching end-of-life, it becomes critical to plan for the upgrade of these systems to complete, or mostly complete, the upgrade before the support is over. One method of tracking systems is to have some type of IT asset listing which details systems and preferably their end-of-life support or end-of-support dates. Alerts could be configured to email staff at certain thresholds so employees are aware of the support status of their systems.
So as with planning for end-of-life system migrations, disposal of old hardware, such as those systems that have reached end-of-life, must be planned 2. When hardware is to be disposed of, appropriate measures must be taken to securely wipe internal memory of the hardware and any storage volumes attached to that hardware. Without these measures, a sold or disposed of device may contain sensitive information that's unintentionally made available to unauthorized users. Hardware disposal is a critical security consideration that's often overlooked. When any piece of hardware is to be disposed of or sold, it's important to understand whether that device has any long-term memory components, hard drives, flash memory, even tape, as these drives may store sensitive information. There are some devices listed here on the slide that often have some level of storage capacity, which could be housing sensitive information about your people or your IT infrastructure. When a device that stores information is to be released from the control of the district, it should always be appropriately sanitized or otherwise wiped to ensure no information is knowingly disclosed to outside interests. Secure sanitization or wiping may include the following methods. Cryptographic erase. That's one where the overwriting of all data occurs with randomly generated information to make that information look like gibberish. You could also use overwrite. That's similar to cryptographic erase, but overwrites with null values, basically zeros, to make the drive completely empty. There's also DDoS. If a device is using magnetic storage, DDoS of the appropriate specification in relation to that drive will render all of the data on the drive useless. Other methods do exist, particularly if the device or drive is not to be utilized again by anyone or resold. When disposing of equipment, you should verify that there are no statutory guidelines or stipulations that apply specifically to your district. Any such regulations may specify certain disposal methods, such as the procurement rules that require methods for sale or disposal of equipment, or maybe a grant that may have placed restrictions on the equipment that was purchased with grant monies. And you need to ensure that you're complying with those requirements as well. Another issue is due to email's pervasive use, email security is essential to protecting the data of any organization. Most business communication is transmitted through email these days, and often time-sensitive lines of conversation are held through email. Any sensitive information, if not properly protected, could be intercepted and accessed by unauthorized users. The classic method of encrypting emails utilizes public key infrastructure, or PKI, in which senders and receivers use public and private keys, or certificates, for identification. In a nutshell, each user would have a public key which would serve as their identity. The public key could be used to encrypt any message sent to that person. PKI works so that only the paired private key could decrypt the message. As only that person has access to that private key, then that information would be secure. The issue with using PKI method is it's bulky and complex to set up. Even if a district successfully and securely configures their side of the process, any external recipient or sending party must also have a strong implementation and understanding of PKI to make the control effective. In order to ease the pain of PKI email security, one method was devised by Microsoft to be a companion to Exchange, which is a widely used process for email across organizations. Exchange hosted encryption, which is now known as Office 365 message encryption, allows message contents to be encrypted by the sender only. This uses a simplistic and interactive method by which receivers may identify and retrieve information. For Office 365 message encryption, encrypted messages are stored securely on Microsoft servers, and any reader must authenticate to a Microsoft server. While this does provide much more security than the plain email, there are some concerns even with this system, such as Microsoft's ability to decrypt your emails, which you need to consider before choosing a solution like this. Many organizations concede that the difficulty with configuring secure email is such that it's more reasonable to simply train staff on the appropriate content of emails and rely on other solutions for securely transmitting information. For example, you might encrypt documents or messages within an archive and then provide the decryption key over the phone to people who need to access that archive. Although that's not a perfect solution, this does require that at least a malicious user not only intercept your email, but also intercept a phone call with that decryption key. Far less likely to occur. Other solutions, such as using Secure File Transfer Protocol, SFTP, or hosting solutions like Dropbox, can augment standard email to provide encrypted channels for the flow of information.
Now, with third-party and cloud services having becoming very popular in recent years, and there's multiple reasons for this. These include cost savings, improved support, and improved product and service. In addition, third-party and cloud services introduce new areas of concern that need to be evaluated. For instance, with the shift to third-party services, lines have blurred between who owns the data and who may have access to data and who's responsible for security of information. Although third parties may have control environments similar to those at the district, the best controls the district has over the third-party vendors are well-made contracts and external audits of these vendors. Contracts specify, amongst other items, the responsibilities of each party, the district and the third party. These are often called service level agreements, or SLAs. But for simplicity, we'll refer to any document which specifies responsibilities in this category as a contract. When preparing for use of a third-party or cloud service, it is critical to ensure that any service you expect to receive from that vendor is explicitly detailed within that contract. If, for example, you expect your third party to provide data recovery services for the information they host for you, your contract should state in as plain English as possible what specifically the third party is responsible for. If such a statement is not made, there may be inherent assumptions that it is responsibility of the district to provide such recovery efforts. Although this may seem strange, considering the district does not have access to the third party's infrastructure, situations do arise where responsibilities are unclear. Always ensure all responsibilities are clear for both you and your district, or you, your district, and your service provider. Another control which may be stipulated in your contract is the performance of external audits over your third-party vendor. In tandem with the performance of the audit, it should be stipulated that you expect or require access to the audit reports when they are released to the vendor. These audits often include internal control reviews similar to those performed by our office. The reports ensure that the necessary control environment is present at the vendor and describes what controls the vendor expects their clients to have in place. Knowing the vendor's expectations helps in preventing any surprises in future contract re-signing and negotiations. With both of these items, you may find that your district is small enough that you do not hold enough weight with the vendor to require any contractual changes or deviations from the standard contract, or for the performance of external audits. If no statewide contract exists that provides these protections, then remember that you do not have to accept the contract from the vendor. As it is your district and perhaps your name on the contract, ensure that you are comfortable with all aspects of the contract before agreeing to any service. If the service is required to meet compliance, investigate other options to meet your regulatory requirements or inquire for exception. You should never feel forced into a contract with a third-party vendor. Next, an incident response plan is established to provide a quick, effective, and orderly response to computer-related events such as virus infections, hacker attempts and break-ins, improper disclosure of confidential information to others, system service interruptions, breach of personal information, and any other events with serious information security implications. Thank you. Hard word to say. Lastly, bring your own device, or BYOD, is a concept where an organization permits employees to carry and utilize their own personal devices, such as smartphones, tablets, and laptops, at work or for business purposes. The benefit of this concept is that the organization can save money or hardware costs, and users gain the ability to use a familiar device to perform their duties. With the introduction of personal devices to the district network, however, many issues arise. The first issue is one of business data versus personal data. As the device is a personally owned device or employee-owned, it is very likely that the user would use the device for personal matters. Consequently, there is opportunity for business and personal data to become intermixed. As business data often contains more sensitive information, or at least information about others, it is critical to know where the business data is stored on the device and maintain complete control of that data, even when it is owned personally by an employee. In tandem, with controlling where data is stored, it is necessary to plan for securing the device if it is lost, stolen, or traded. Remotely wiping capability allows an organization to control the data present on any device. As the device is personal property of the employee, either the employee must agree that the entire device may be wiped when issues occur, or separate data partitions must be configured for business and personal use. Finally, with any personal device connecting to the organization network, it is important to ensure that the appropriate security controls are active on any system. These controls should meet or exceed the requirements placed upon district devices. Controls include anti-malware protection, disk encryption, and VPN configurations. Unique to personal devices is the possibility of separate boot environments and/or data drives to separate business from personal use. So now I'm going to turn things over to Chris to wrap things up.
Thanks, Phil. As we wrap up our presentation today, we wanted to provide you a quick list of the topics that will be covered in our pre-recorded advanced class when it's posted. That class will dive a little deeper into some of the topics that we covered today, and it'll cover some areas that are more technical in nature as well. In that presentation, we'll be addressing network segregation related to separating devices from each other, as much as possible at least, to add more security. We'll also cover server hardening related to specifically configuring systems post-install to be as secure as possible while still providing the necessary services to end users. We'll be touching on secure baseline configurations. Per the NSA, a secure baseline is a pre-configured and security-hardened machine-ready image that contains an organization's common operating system and application software. The concept of secure baselines is to reconfigure any operating system defaults to meet the security expectations of your district. In that presentation, we'll also address Active Directory security considerations. For this topic, while we can't cover every aspect of Active Directory security, we will cover a few issues that we've seen as problems in our audits. We'll also hit website security, primarily the use of encryption protocols to secure web traffic. And finally, data loss prevention, which involves preventing, to the extent possible, the malicious or unintentional extraction of data from your systems. We'll discuss possible deterrents for end users and the use of policies to build a culture of security. We know we've covered quite a few topics in this webinar and even more to come in the advanced topics, as I just mentioned. So to sum things up, network and security controls truly rely on a layered defense in-depth strategy. There is no silver bullet to protecting and configuring systems, and each device and control must be carefully considered to integrate and interoperate with the rest of your control environment. In this presentation, we've only scratched the surface of network and security controls. Each area covered in this webinar has many nuances and could likely be an entire separate class. We have introduced you to each topic and provided some information to help you quickly improve your security stance. But each environment has its own requirements, and there may be other specific controls in your environment that you'll need to research and develop on your own. With that in mind, it's important to remember that you need to truly understand your own environment to fully implement these controls. Without a clear understanding of your network and systems, you won't be able to ensure that you have covered any potential weaknesses. You may even find that by considering the controls in the webinar today, you actually thought a little more about what type of systems run in your own environment than you had already. At this point, we'd like to have you send in any questions that you have regarding the topics covered today. As best as possible, please try to keep your questions general and not too specific to your own environment. If, however, you have questions regarding a specific problem in your environment, which may not be applicable to all those attending the webinar, you can still send those in now, and we'll contact you after the webinar to discuss your questions further and provide the best answer possible given your situation. While we wait for your questions to come in, let's take a moment to review what we're still planning to cover in our last webinar in the initial IT series. The last topic from our original 4-part series is data backup and recovery. We'll take a look at developing a comprehensive data backup strategy, disaster recovery, and we'll look at how districts can ensure their disaster recovery plans are well developed, fully documented, and understood by the employees involved in that recovery process. We'll also cover testing data backup and disaster recovery plans so that when the worst does happen, which we know you all hope and we hope doesn't happen, you'll be as ready as possible to keep your critical operations running. If you have additional topics that you'd like to see us address in future IT webinars as well, please feel free to send comments in now, or you can, of course, contact us after the webinar. Along with these webinars and the advanced webinar that will be posted to our website in the coming weeks, we have IT FAQs posted where all of our school district FAQs are posted, reports and publications for school districts choosing the FAQ area. We'll send out an email when the advanced class is posted so that you can go to our website and find that class there. And you can also send us your questions by email as shown on the screen or call us anytime. It looks like we haven't received any questions to cover at this time. I think I probably gave you enough time to type some in. We did receive one just now about the timing of the next webinar on disaster recovery and backups. And I would say that will happen in the next couple of months, probably mid to late summer. So I appreciate the question. It's always nice to be able to give the information on timing of these things. We did get another question about where session 2 in this webinar process is, and it is, of course, on our website under reports and publications, school districts. If you choose webinars, you may have to scroll down a little bit to find the second session. There's, I believe, a few pages of webinars now, and I can hardly believe we've done enough to fill 3 or 4 pages worth of website area of webinars, but we have. So if you don't find it right off, just keep going through the webinar slides there, the webinar site, and look for that specific topic. You could search it based on IT roles and separation of responsibilities on our website and probably come to it slightly faster. But I appreciate that question as well, because I think that there is a lot of good information in those previous webinars, and I'm always happy to see people utilizing them. All right, with that, I'm going to just thank you all for attending and participating in today's webinar. We hope that you found the information helpful and that you'll join us again for the IT control webinars in the future. Today's recorded webinar will be posted on our website shortly, and I hope you all have a great afternoon.